Hey everybody, it's JJ with Audio Workstations, coming back at you with another audio basics video. In today's video, we're going to talk about EQs. Okay, EQ. First of all, short for equalizer. So what is an equalizer or an EQ? Well, it's probably going to be the most common tool you're going to end up using in audio production. It's the main tool we use to essentially get things to sound better. So what are we doing with an EQ? An EQ allows us to either increase or decrease the amplitude or volume of frequencies in our audio. So the first thing to not get confused is just an EQ is not necessarily adding frequencies, it's amplifying or reducing frequencies that already exist in the audio. So in sound, we measure certain frequencies in what's known as hertz, which we shorten for Hz. And the moment we start getting into the 1,000+ hertz range, we refer to that as kilohertz or KHZ for short, or typically most of us will just use the term K to refer to that frequency range. For example, 1,000 hertz we would typically refer to as 1K. And volume, more specifically amplitude, we measure in decibels or short for dBs. So you'll see typically on an EQ, you're going to see your frequencies measured in that hertz, and you're going to see the amplitude measured in plus or minus dBs. So an EQ allows us to amplify more of the frequencies that are pleasant to our ears and decrease the amplitude of frequencies that are unpleasant, that we don't like, or maybe that just doesn't sound good with the mix. Okay, so first step to using an EQ is being able to identify what type of EQ you have. So the first way we typically define an EQ is by the amount of bands. The amount of bands refer to how many different areas can I amplify different frequency ranges. For example, on this EQ, we have 7 different areas where we can change the amplitude of certain frequency ranges. Therefore, this is a 7-band EQ. So the second step to identifying what type of EQ you have is the knobs or the adjustments you can make. So pretty much every type of EQ is going to have a gain knob that you can adjust the amplitude. But if you also have the ability to change which frequency you want to adjust, that's what's called a semi-parametric EQ, if you just have the ability to adjust the amplitude and the frequency. However, you may also have an additional knob typically referred to as Q. This stands for bandwidth, and if you have the Q knob, this is what we would call a fully parametric EQ. So you can see on the EQ we're using here, we have a gain, a frequency knob, and a Q knob. This is what would be known as a fully parametric EQ. Okay, so once you establish what type of EQ you're actually using, now we can talk about the EQ curves, and there's 5 of them. The first 2 types of EQ curves are what's known as a high-pass filter and a low-pass filter. A high-pass filter can also be known as a low-end roll-off, and a low-pass filter can be known as a high-end roll-off. These 2 types of EQ curves are the exact same, except for they do the opposite. So a high-pass filter, also known as an HPF, is going to roll off the low end of a certain frequency range and everything below it. For example, in this case, 100 hertz we're starting at, and we're rolling everything off below that. A low-pass filter is going to do the exact same thing, except for the higher frequency range. So it's going to start at a certain frequency and roll off everything above that. These are great EQ curves for completely eliminating unwanted frequencies. A lot of times, instruments won't have many frequencies in the lower end of the frequency spectrum. Therefore, any frequencies that do exist in that lower end spectrum may be unwanted frequencies. A classic example would be your vocal. If you do a vocal recording and you have you left the speakers on, so you got some of that low-end subwoofer bleeding onto the microphone. Well, that's mostly going to be in the lower end of the frequencies, and if there's not really anything in the vocals there, we can eliminate a lot of those frequencies. And with a low-pass filter, a lot of times, right, noise will exist in the very high end of the frequency spectrum. And again, if you have an instrument that doesn't really depend on that high part of the frequency range, we can eliminate some of that noise. Okay, so your next two types of EQ curves are going to be a high shelf and a low shelf. Similar to the high pass and low pass, where they're the same exact thing, only the opposite. So a high shelf is going to start at a specific frequency, typically in the higher end of the frequency spectrum, and it's going to allow us to increase or decrease the amplitude of that frequency, but also every frequency above that, typically in a kind of equal level, like a shelf would be, therefore the name shelving EQ. The low shelf's going to do the same thing with the starting frequency, typically in the lower range, but increase or decrease the amplitude of all the frequencies below that range. These are going to be the most common types of EQs around, specifically for consumers. A lot of people will have these in their car systems where you have that treble and bass knob. That's a high shelf and a low shelf with a fixed frequency. Your last type of EQ curve is known as the peak dip, also known as the bell curve. So this is going to allow us to increase or decrease the amplitude of a specific frequency and a limited number of frequencies around it. And this is where that Q control mostly comes into play, because the main job of the Q control, also known as the bandwidth, is going to allow us to adjust the amount of frequencies being affected around the chosen frequency. If you have a Q control on your shelving EQs, what that is going to do is adjust kind of the curve of that shelf. And if you have a Q control on your high pass and low pass, that's going to adjust how aggressive that curve is on that roll off. So the one thing you have to keep in mind here with actually using an EQ is there's no certain way to actually EQ something. Yes, there's just some general things that we'll typically do on a vocal, on a kick drum, on a bass guitar, but it's always going to change. This is what makes us audio engineers and not audio operators, is everything's going to be different. We can have the same exact audio file, and I can bring in 5 different engineers with the same EQ, and each one of our EQs are going to look a little bit different at least. So that's the tricky part of audio engineering, is there's no way to say this is how you EQ a vocal. Like I said, there are some similar things that people will do on certain instruments, and there are also plenty of helpful musical charts to show you what instruments will focus in on certain frequency ranges, so I recommend checking those out because that can definitely be helpful. But in general, you have to keep in mind that it's always going to be different every time you EQ something. In general, EQ just takes a lot of practice, and you're never going to be 100% with it, right? We struggle every day trying to get that perfect EQ, but just keep working at it and you'll get better and more comfortable with EQ. One of the best tips I can give is when you first start EQing, it's very easy to try to just boost frequencies because we like to hear things that we like more. But it can actually be better practice to try cutting, try reducing the amplitude of certain frequencies. That can actually be a lot more beneficial a lot of times than trying to boost all of the frequencies. So I hope this helped for all of you audio newbies. If you like this type of content, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you next time.